Welcome back now for the news in detail. Beginning from Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, which says he will no longer seek dialogue with India. In an interview with the New York Times, Khan said India mistook Pakistan's peace overtures for appeasement, adding there is no point talking. Khan also demanded that the UN peacekeepers and observers be allowed in occupied Kashmir, where India intends to carry out genocide. More in this report.
The Pakistani Prime Minister said India is denying Kashmiris their right to observe religious practices, including the recent Eid al-Adha festival. He drew attention to the abuse and violence suffered by millions of Kashmiris living under Indian occupation. Speaking on the first International Day for Victims of Violence based on religion, Khan said the world must prevent the impending Indian genocide of Kashmiris. Pakistan's Foreign Ministry spokesman Dr. Mohammad Faisal said Indian forces killed 4 Kashmiris in search operations just last week. He said scores of others were injured by the Indian occupation forces. Faisal urged the international community to take notice of Indian atrocities in the occupied valley. Meanwhile, the UN has once again called for talks between Pakistan and India to resolve the crisis sparked by New Delhi's annexation of occupied Kashmir. Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the disputed region is governed by the UN Charter and Security Council resolutions.
Still on occupied Kashmir, Sweden has called for a comprehensive investigation into human rights violations by Indian occupation forces in Kashmir. Denmark and Norway also say they are closely monitoring developments in the occupied valley. In a telephone conversation, Denmark's Foreign Minister Jeppe Sebastian said Copenhagen supports the UN and EU statements on Kashmir. Kufod urged Pakistan and India to start a dialogue and refrain from further escalation. Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström called for a dialogue to resolve differences between Pakistan and India. Norway's Foreign Minister Ine Marie Eriksen expressed concern over the situation in occupied Kashmir after its annexation by India on August 5th. She urged Pakistan and India to de-escalate the situation and ease tensions. As the world marks the first International Day for Victims of Religious Violence, Kashmiris endure the 18th day of India's lockdown of the occupied valley. Several Kashmiris have been killed and more than 4,000 detained since India's revoked Kashmir's special status on August 5th. More in this report.
The disputed Himalayan state of Kashmir has been turned into a prison by Indian occupation forces. For the last few weeks, a crushing curfew has brought life to a shuddering halt. Robbed of their basic human rights, Kashmiris could not observe the religious festival of Eid al-Adha. Residents say they are hostages in their own houses.
Everything over here is under the police's watch and everything has been shut as if we were in jail. Small children have been shut in lockers. It feels as if we are locked down.
Cut off from the world by a total communications blackout, Kashmiris have been gagged and prevented from expressing their rejection of India's annexation. Over 1 million Indian troops have been deployed in occupied Kashmir since New Delhi violated UN resolutions by revoking the status of the disputed territory.
International NGO Genocide Watch has issued a genocide alert for Indian occupied Kashmir. It called upon the United Nations and its members to warn India not to commit genocide in Kashmir. The NGO noted early signs of massacres in the occupied valley, stating a precedent of genocidal massacres with impunity. The organization warned of a blackout of communication since India's revocation of Kashmir's autonomous status. It underscored the threats posed by the ruling BJP's Hindu nationalist ideology and heavy military presence. The organization also highlighted human rights violations, including torture, rape, detentions. It expressed concern over the arbitrary arrests and deportations of Muslim political and human rights leaders. Moving on now, Iran says it is prepared to work on French proposals to salvage the 2015 nuclear deal. Paris has proposed softened sanctions and a compensation mechanism in return for Tehran's full compliance with the pact. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif says Iran will start working on the proposals from tomorrow. Zarif says he is looking forward to having a serious conversation with French President Emmanuel Macron about the possibilities of moving forward. He says that Iran does not want war, but it won't remain quiet when threatened by U.S. efforts to build a naval coalition in the Gulf. Meanwhile, Iran has justified a domestically built mobile air defense system amid rising tensions with the United States. Defense Minister Amir Hatami says the new system can lock on targets over 300 kilometers away and destroy them at 200 kilometers. Syria's government says it will open a corridor for civilians to leave the rebel-held northwestern region of Idlib. The government says it will provide food, shelter and medical care to people fleeing the war-torn area. This comes a day after Syrian forces recaptured the strategic town of Khan Sheikhun from rebels. Idlib is the last major rebel-held bastion in Syria after 8 years of civil war. Meanwhile, Turkey says it will host leaders of Russia and Iran for a summit on the Syrian war next month. Meanwhile, Turkey and the United States have launched the first phase of a safe zone plan in northeast Syria. The Turkish Defense Ministry says the plan was approved in a telephone call between the defense ministers of the two countries. Turkey's Hulusi Akar and USA's Mark Esper agreed to hold delegation-level talks in Ankara soon. Earlier, the Pentagon said the security mechanism in Syria would be executed in designated phases. Ankara and the United States agreed on August 7th to establish a joint operations center in Turkey to coordinate the safe zone. The proposed zone aims to secure a 400-kilometer strip of land along Syria's northeastern border with Turkey. Syria has called the safe zone a violation of its territorial sovereignty. Meanwhile, 7 Kurdistan Workers Party militants have been killed during security operations in southeast Turkey. The Interior Ministry says the operation was carried out to protect Turkish Petroleum Corporation workers. It says 5 terrorists were killed during the operation in Mardin province. 2 others were killed in an air-backed counter-terrorism operation in Sirnak province. Earlier, 3 Turkish soldiers were killed and another wounded in a PKK attack in Silopi. Ankara accuses the PKK of killing some 40,000 people during the insurgency it launched in 1978. Now, Abdullah Hamdok has been sworn in as Sudan's new prime minister as the country embarks on a 3-year transition to civilian rule. The economist was appointed by the leader of the newly formed 11-member Sovereign Council by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. The US, Britain and Norway have welcomed Hamdok's appointment, calling it a historic moment for Sudan. Talking to reporters in Khartoum, Hamdok said his priorities are achieving peace and solving Sudan's economic crisis. The new Sovereign Council replaces the military junta that took charge in April after popular protests forced the removal of President Omar al-Bashir. General Burhan will lead the council of 6 civilians and 4 other military officers. The new government will run the country until general elections scheduled for 2022. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron says there is not enough time to negotiate a new Brexit agreement. Speaking alongside United Kingdom's Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Paris, Macron said no one will wait until October 31st for a good solution. Johnson says Britain wants a deal, but it will not establish border controls between European Union member Republic of Ireland and Britain's Northern Ireland. He says technical solutions to the backstop issue are readily available and have been discussed at length. Britain is set to leave the European Union on October 31st. Now moving on, Kosovo lawmakers voted to dissolve parliament on Friday, paving the way for national election. This follows the resignation of Prime Minister Ramush Haradinaj in July. A total of 89 deputies voted to dissolve the 120-seat parliament. An election should take place within 45 days. Haradinaj stepped down after being summoned by a special court in The Hague to face charges arising from the Balkan War of the 1990s. This could lead to the postponement of the EU-mediated summit next month. Russia and China have asked the United Nations Security Council to meet today to discuss a cruise missile test conducted by the US on Sunday. They have asked UN Disarmament Affairs Chief Izumi Nakamitsutu to brief the 15-member body. Moscow and Beijing say Washington's plan to develop and deploy medium-range missiles are a threat to international peace and security. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zheng Shuang says the United States is stalking a new global arms race. He says the United States' action will lead to a new Cold War and have a negative impact on regional and global security. Earlier, Russia said it will respond to the US cruise missile test. This US test is the first since it pulled out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty earlier this month. European leaders say Russia needs to resolve the Ukraine crisis before it can rejoin the G7 group of nations. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has also opposed Russia's return to the G7. Zelensky says nothing has changed since Russia was removed from the then G8. This followed US President Donald Trump's call to readmit Russia to the bloc ahead of its summit on Saturday. French President Emmanuel Macron says readmitting Russia without resolving the Ukraine issue will be of an error. Germany's Foreign Minister Heiko Maas also called for Russia and Ukraine to revive peace talks before the measure could be considered. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says it was too early to start considering Russia's inclusion.
Given the continuing instability, civil war, the war in Ukraine, given Russia's provocations, not just in Ukraine but in many other places, I must say I am very much with Chancellor Merkel in thinking that the case has yet to be made out for Russia to return to the G7.
More news to come up after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now. South Korea says the United States and North Korea may soon resume denuclearization talks, but Pyongyang says it has no interest in dialogue as long as Washington and Seoul persist with military provocations. South Korea's Deputy National Security Advisor revealed the resumption of talks after meeting with the U.S. envoy Stephen Biegun. But North Korea's foreign ministry says the U.S. cruise missile test and its delivery of 2 F-35 stealth warplanes to South Korea are dangerous. In a statement, Pyongyang said it is committed to resolving all issues through dialogue, but would not accept talks accompanied by military threats. Indonesia has arrested 34 people and cut internet access in Papua province after violence protests. Earlier, protesters torched buildings, a market and a prison over the mistreatment of students and perceived ethnic discrimination. Smaller demonstrations and rallies have flared in different parts of Indonesia since yesterday. In Jakarta, Papuan students marched from the army's headquarters to the gates of the presidential palace. Demonstrators demanded the right to self-determination and an end to racism and colonialism in Papua. The Communications Ministry said the internet has been blocked to prevent incitement to violence through social media. President Joko Widodo has ordered the army and police chiefs to act against officers treating students in a racist manner. Meanwhile, 9 people have been killed after heavy downpours and mudslides battered China's southwest Sichuan province. State media says 35 more are still missing from Aba, Tibetan and Xi'an. Aba's Emergency Management Bureau says over 1,600 rescue workers are looking for the missing. It says more than 100,000 people need to be evacuated from the area. Torrential rains have damaged roads, bridges and some 900 houses over the past 3 days. In Yemen, the United Nations has warned critical aid programs will be jeopardized if $1 billion of pledged funds are not released. It has described the situation in Yemen as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The United Nations says food rations for 12 million people in the war-torn country would be reduced if new funding does not arrive in the coming weeks. Earlier this year, donors pledged to give over $2.5 billion to meet the urgent needs of Yemenis, but the United Nations says less than half of the committed money has been received. Meanwhile, the Arab coalition fighting in Yemen says it has shot down 2 Houthi rebel drones targeting the southern city of Khamis Moshed. The rebels have not yet confirmed the incident. Now, a court in South Africa says displaying the country's apartheid-era flag is hate speech and a violation of equality laws. Cape Town's High Court has ruled the apartheid flag is a discrimination against black people. In 2017, a white nationalist group flew the apartheid flag at a demonstration against attacks and killings of farmers. The Nelson Mandela Foundation filed a petition to declare the flag's display race-based hate speech and harassment. Judge Finis Mojapelo said the order is not an outright ban on displaying the flag.
Any display of the old flag constitutes A. hate speech in terms of Section 10(1) of the Equality Act.
The apartheid flag was replaced with South Africa's current multicolored rainbow flag in 1994 with the end of the apartheid. Now moving on to Nigeria, which has marked 3 years free of epidemic wild polio. Health officials say the progress can help declare Africa polio-free early next year. For details, watch this report.
Polio is a highly infectious disease, mainly affecting children under the age of 5. Africa's last case of wild polio was recorded in Nigeria 3 years ago.
Today, the 21st day of August 2019, Nigeria makes history, having achieved 3 years without a case of white polio virus, WPV. The last white polio virus case was isolated in a child in Borno State on the 21st of August 2016.
Health officials are keen to sustain the historic gains.
Let's remember that the battle is not over yet. We have to maintain our efforts and intensify them to make sure the historic gains are sustained and that polio-free certification is obtained for Nigeria in due time next year.
Since Nigeria's last case, the government launched many extra vaccination campaigns and improved surveillance and routine immunization. To begin the process of certifying the continent polio-free, a team of independent scientists will examine data from all 47 countries.
Russia has launched an unmanned rocket carrying a life-size humanoid robot that will spend 10 days on the International Space Station. The Fedor, with identification number Skybot F-85, is the first ever robot sent to space by Russia. Fedor took off in a Soyuz rocket today from Russia's Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. The silvery anthropomorphic robot stands 1 meter 80 centimeters tall and weighs 160 kilograms. Fedor copies human movements, a key skill that allows it to remotely help astronauts carry out tasks while they are strapped into an exoskeleton. It will dock with the space station on Saturday and stay there till September 7th. Near humans are traveling in the Soyuz spacecraft in order to test a new emergency rescue system. Now, stock markets in Asia and Europe have slid on uncertainty about US interest rate cuts. London's FTSE 100 has lost 0.2%, while the CAC in Paris is also down a fraction. Frankfurt's DAX index is trading flat. In Asia, overnight gains in New York were overshadowed by news that manufacturing activity in Japan slipped for a 4th consecutive month in August. Exports fell at a sharper pace, reversing early gains on the Nikkei 225. The Shanghai Composite also closed flat. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index dipped 1% as nervous investors sought more clarity on the US Federal Reserve Bank's stimulus plans. Now, in the ICC World Test Championship, Sri Lanka take on New Zealand for the second match in Colombo. Sri Lanka are batting first after winning the toss. 3 hours of play were lost to rain on the opening day of the match. New Zealand are contesting to level the series after the hosts won the opener in goal by 6 wickets. Both teams have made one change from the first test. New Zealand brought in all-rounder Colin de Grandham to replace spinner Michel Santner, while the host Sri Lanka drafted in off spinner Dilruvan Perera for Akila Dhananjaya. In Major League Soccer, the New York Red Bulls have won their latest match of the Eastern Conference, beating DC United by 2-1. Playing at Audi Field, Bulls eye midfielder Alejandro Romero scored the opening goal in the 6th minute. United Ola Kamara equalized early in the second half, but Daniel Royal regained the Bulls' lead by striking the winning penalty in the 59th minute. Both teams finished the game with 10 men. United striker Wayne Rooney and Bulls defender Amro Tariq were both sent off. Now, at the World Badminton Championship in Switzerland, Singapore's Yeo Jia Min beat Vietnam's Si Trang by 2-1 to reach the quarterfinals of the women's singles. Yeo is the first player into the World Championship quarterfinals. She will next meet either Thailand's Ratchanok Aintanan or Indonesia's Gregoria Mariska Tunjung. Now let's have a look at the weather updates. Well, that's all for now. For more news and updates, stay tuned with Indus News.